Hey, how you doing? Thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be doing a mix review of a song that was sent by a buddy of mine. If you're watching this, that means he did allow me to post this and share, his mix, so I can talk about the effect of loudness on dynamic range and overall quality of your mix. Let's hear it. Can you feel the love tonight? Tonight, the peace the evening brings. The world for once in perfect harmony with all its living things. Okay, so let's get down to reviewing the mix. So what had happened was he sent me an initial mix. I listened to it. We had a number of conversations based on some observations that I had. One of the biggest ones being that the mix was way too loud, and as a result, that did greatly diminish his dynamic range. After that conversation, he went back, reworked it, sent a second one, which was on point. I just love how he delivered it. And I thought this would be a great reference point to talk about the effects of gain staging and loudness on the overall mix and some of the best practices. This is a very practical demonstration of the implications of loudness on the overall quality of a mix. So what I've got here is a side-by-side comparison of his initial mix and his reworked mix. So before getting into any statistics, I just want you to look at the difference in the waveforms and how they look. What you're seeing now currently is the waveform of his first mix. And I'm gonna switch over, and what you're looking at now is the waveform of his reworked mix. Now, you can already see the difference. This waveform is much larger, which means the mix was much louder. And as you can see, the waveforms are pretty much almost getting to the edges on either side, right? And we moved to the second mix, smaller, more even, and it ended up sounding much better as well. One of the things I immediately want to point out is if you look at the waveform carefully of this reworked mix, you will notice that the transients, right? The transients, meaning the spiky, loud parts in this mix are well preserved. Whereas if we go back to the previous one, you will notice that the transients are almost obscured. That is because the mix was too loud. So because the mix was too loud, what ended up happening is when he moved from his mixing stage to his mastering stage, he had to go through, as you always do, go through some sort of compression and limiting in your mastering chain. So what's going to happen is if you feed your mastering compressor and mastering limiter a much louder signal, the compressor and the limiter is going to work much harder, naturally, right? So what that's going to do is to affect your dynamic range negatively. And that results in the transients getting swashed out. So again, moving back to his reworked mix, with the transients well preserved and it's well balanced because he was letting the mix breathe. And what obviously happened here is because it was quieter, all the effects, especially compressors, right, on his mix bus did not have to work that hard. So they didn't squash out the transients. They were well preserved and balanced out evenly. Even when he moved to his mastering stage and the mastering limiter and compressor, same principle, didn't work that hard. And the transients were well preserved, resulting in a much better quality mix. So what are the things that we need to look out for to ensure that we get these kinds of results? I will start with the concept of gain staging because loudness has a lot to do with it. So gain staging is just making sure that your levels, right from the production and mixing stage, all the way through the mastering stage are done correctly. So gain staging is actually more critical at your mix stage, because if you don't gain stage your tracks correctly or your mix correctly, it's going to be too loud. And if you're going to send your mix to the mastering stage when it's too loud, you're already at a disadvantage. Your mastering chain effects are going to be working that much harder, and they're going to further reduce your dynamic range, not in a very pleasing way. As a common best practice, balance out the levels of your individual tracks such that the levels on your master fader are at least minus 6 dB and they don't get any louder. That way, you'll end up going into the mastering stage with that headroom of minus 6 dB to work with. And of course, during the mastering stage, it's going to be some sort of compressor and some sort of limiter, and those are going to further reduce that headroom, which is why you need to make sure that you leave enough headroom for mastering. If you don't follow this principle and your gain staging is not correctly done, and your mix is literally hitting your master fader at 0 dB, right, or slightly below 0 dB, that means you have not left enough headroom for the mastering stage, right? And that is a problem, because theoretically in digital audio, the ceiling is 0 dB, right? So however much space you leave between 0 dB and the loudest part of your music or material, that's going to be the headroom that is going to be left for the mastering stage. I think loudness is the biggest part of it, and gain staging is important. And with this simple principle of going back to gain stage his tracks in his mix and targeting a minus 6 dB maximum loudness for his master fader or his master bus, this is what resulted in a much better and overall sounding mix. So now let's talk about exactly how much better it is. So the first thing I'm going to want to look at is the loudness. I'm going to start with the initial mix, right? So the thing I want to pay attention to is the integrated loudness, which is at minus 9.4 LUFS. That is loud, extremely loud, and that's obviously a problem. And then the other metric I want you to pay attention to is the one at the bottom here, which is his loudness range, or the dynamic range. And it's all the way down at 2.1, which is, again, way too small. He should be aiming for a minimum of 4, right? Going up for a dynamic range. And for your integrated loudness, he should be looking at minus 14 dB LUFS and not veer off too much from that point. The reason for minus 14 LUFS is because streaming platforms, namely Spotify, have that level as the ceiling. So any track that is louder than minus 14 LUFS is going to be compressed, and that's going to have a negative effect on the integrity of the mix altogether. Right, now let me take you through a preview of what both of the mixes would sound like if they went through streaming platforms. So I'm going to pull out streaming preview, right? And we are going to start with the initial mix and see what the simulation is going to give us in terms of what it would sound like on streaming platforms. So the parameters here are the playback loudness is minus 14 LUFS. Remember, we talked about this number earlier. And quality is 96 kbps, okay, which is a reasonable test parameter to use. So I'm going to click compare, and we're going to listen to the initial mix as is, and then we will listen to the initial mix with the streaming preview to hear what it would sound like, or what it's going to sound like if it goes on to a streaming platform. Okay, so previewing the original audio.
The world for once in perfect harmony with all its needs.
Okay, streaming preview.
Can you feel the love tonight?
I can already notice there is a huge difference in loudness, of course, but also the quality of the mix is extremely diminished. I'm gonna keep playing this back, just listen closely.
tonight. The peace the evening brings.
I've switched back to the original audio.
The world for once in perfect harmony with all its living things.
Yeah, so I kept switching back and forth, and I think it's very clear. If this initial mix, which was very loud, went on for streaming, it would definitely be compressed, and the audio quality is gonna sound that bad, and the low end suffering the most. Let's now do the same thing with the remixed final master. Okay, so click and compare, allowing it to process there. And once it's done, I think it's done. Okay, so let's hear the original audio, and we're gonna switch back and forth to what it would sound like on a streaming platform. Right, let's go.
Can you feel the love tonight? Tonight. The peace the evening brings. The world for once in perfect harmony with all its living things.
Okay, so what you immediately see with this reworked master is there isn't much of an audible difference between the original one and the streaming preview simulation, which just can be interpreted as there's not going to be any audible loss in quality when this version of the file is uploaded onto streaming platforms. And the reason is the loudness levels were where they needed to be, and that ensured that the mix and its integrity are preserved. So this is way too loud, and the result of it being this loud is that dynamic range has been sacrificed. I'm going to switch over to his reworked mix after properly gain staging everything, right? Take a look at this. So he got his integrated loudness, LUFS, down to minus 13.6 LUFS, which is closer to minus 14, right? The target. So this is great, and this is awesome. Now, I want you to look at the result of that. His dynamic range increased from 2.1 to 3.4. So from a technical perspective, this has just verified and proved what we just talked about, which is that your loudness has an impact on your dynamic range. And if your track is too loud, you are losing and sacrificing your dynamic range and hurting the integrity of your mix. As you can see, this checks out and it proves the point. Let's look at something else. And I want us to start with his initial mix. This tool is basically looking at the file. So it's analyzed the waveform, and it has a suggestion for what needs to be done to sort of correct and maximize this for loudness. So I'm going to click Learn just to ensure that, okay. So it's got some suggestions. Of course, it's picked out that, it's integrated LUFS is at minus 9.36. And these are some of the suggestions that it has put forward to sort of rebalance and optimize this mix for loudness. So if I click to render here, then these are going to be applied. Now, I'm going to switch over to his reworked master, right? And I'm going to click Learn again and see what sort of suggestions RX Advanced is going to have for us with regards to what we need to do to optimize for loudness. So I'm clicking Learn. Okay, interesting. So look at the pop-up window. No additional processing recommended. Your audio's loudness measurement is already optimal. There. So again, this has proved that this mix is on point And with regards to loudness, it's exactly where it needs to be. So speaking of loudness optimization, I'm going to take you to another tool, Spectrum, right? So this is just reading the overall spectrum of the audio and plotting out the average. And I want to bring your attention to the lower frequencies, right? So again, the view we're looking at now is the reworked mix. I'm going to switch back to his initial mix, right? And as you can see, there has been a bit of a change in the waveform profile. I'm going to switch back again. Pay attention. See, the waveform has sort of reduced in loudness. And this goes in keeping with the fact that this was a much quieter and more optimal mix. There's a number of things happening at the low end that I want to point out. Let's go to the low end and, maybe go here, right? The loudest peak, this is about 200 hertz. It's around 18, 19 dB thereabouts. And the loudest in the sub frequencies, that's below 100 hertz, is around 28 dB thereabouts. So I'm going to switch back to the initial first mix. You will see that in the sub frequencies, the loudest part in the sub frequencies is there, around 29 dB, right? And the loudest part in your bass, that's around 200 kilohertz, was around minus 14. So this was generally a much louder low end, right? But here is the interesting thing. The perceived loudness of especially the bass in his first mix was very low. To the ears, it was much quieter. But the waveform shows that it was actually much louder compared to this mix, which is his final mix. What's happening here is, if you study the waveforms, his final mix has much quieter loudest peaks around 200, which is around minus 19 dB, right? And going back to his initial mix, it has a much louder low-end profile, right? If you look at the waveform. But interestingly enough, the perceived loudness of the bass in the second mix is much better. So in his second and final reworked mix, the bass was much louder and it was just sitting at much better levels in relation to the entire voices and the entire track, right? Even though when you look at the waveform, right, it will show you that this final mix in the low end was much lower in loudness than the first one. So that is interesting because what's happening here is, yes, in this first waveform, right, the low ends were louder, but the perceived overall effect of the perceived loudness to the ears was compromised. This just goes to prove that if you run a much louder mix, the result is your entire mastering chain is going to work way harder because you're passing a louder signal through it. And some of the effects is you lose some frequency balance there, in that your perceived loudness reduces, even though, the energy in the low end in terms of waveform is louder. And so this again goes to point out further why it's important to ensure that your mix is optimized in terms of gain staging and the loudness levels are where they need to be, because along the chain, you're going to maintain the integrity of your mix and the frequency balance is going to be where it needs to be, such that the loudness and perceived loudness, especially of your low end, is intact and it doesn't get distorted because your limiter or your compressor on your mix bus or your master bus was overworking. Okay, so I think that's it. Thanks for watching. And yeah, I hope I'm going to be sharing more of these kinds of videos. Once again, just a big shout out to Mwewa. Thank you for sharing your work, and thank you for this beautiful and amazing mix. So I'm just gonna play it once again as I sign out. All right, guys, thank you very much.
Can you feel the love tonight? Tonight, the peace the evening brings. The world for once in perfect harmony with all its leaves.